My name is Celeste Marchetti. I'm 35 and I'm a forensic document examiner, which means I've spent the last 11 years testifying in courtrooms about the exact question most families never think they'll need answered: whether a signature on a piece of paper is actually real. So when my father died and a codicil surfaced 3 days later, cutting me out of the family estate in language I'd never once heard him use in 71 years of being exactly himself, I already knew precisely which four tools I was going to pull out of my bag at the reading of that will. What I didn't know yet was that the notary whose stamp appeared on that page had never once, in 15 years of practice, actually met my father. Welcome back to her final chapter, where every story starts with silence and ends with power. If you've ever had the truth dismissed as not that complicated by people who needed it to stay complicated, this one's for you. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. I grew up in the back room of Marchetti Rare Manuscripts, a small but respected dealership my father Vincent built over 4 decades on Philadelphia's Antique Row, specializing in early American documents, letters, and literary manuscripts sold to collectors and institutions across the country. I learned to read a signature before I learned to read most books, my father holding a loupe over a Revolutionary War-era letter and explaining ink composition and paper fiber the way other fathers explain baseball. I became a forensic document examiner formally at 26, after 3 years of specialized training following my undergraduate degree in chemistry, learning to analyze handwriting under stress, ink chromatography, indentation evidence, and the dozens of other scientific methods that separate a genuine signature from a skilled forgery. I now testify roughly 15 times a year in probate disputes, criminal cases, and contested wills, work that requires patience most people don't realize exists behind a simple signature on a page. My quirk, if you want to call it that, is that I still carry a small UV flashlight in my bag everywhere I go, alongside my formal examination kit, a habit that started the week I caught my first ink discrepancy on a supposedly 18th century letter my father was preparing to sell, a habit he used to tease me about at the dinner table, calling it my flashlight instinct, before it became the exact tool that would end up mattering more than either of us understood. What most people don't understand about my job is how much of it comes down to something my father actually taught me first, without meaning to train a forensic examiner. A person's handwriting changes under stress, illness, and time in specific, predictable, scientifically observable ways. A signature written by a confident, healthy hand looks fundamentally different from one written by the same person 3 days before death, and no amount of practiced forgery fully accounts for every one of those differences at once. The call came on a Thursday morning, my brother Dominic's voice carrying the particular controlled calm he uses when he's already decided how a conversation is going to end. "Celeste, we need you to come by Saturday. Mom wants to read Dad's will together. Keep it simple, just close family." My father had died 11 days earlier, a sudden cardiac event, and the funeral had been small, quiet, exactly the way he'd have wanted it. I told Dominic I'd be there. He added, almost as an afterthought, "There's a codicil the attorney found in Dad's files dated a few weeks before he passed. It changes a few things with the business, nothing dramatic, just don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be." Dominic had used some version of that phrase for 9 years, ever since I'd flagged a signature discrepancy on a manuscript our father was about to sell to a private collector for $18,000, a piece I'd examined out of simple habit and found troubling under proper light. "It's just paperwork, Celeste," my father had told me then, waving off my concerns at the same kitchen table where I'd later hear variations of that sentence for the rest of my career. "You've got your science, I've got my eye. Don't ruin a sale over ink chemistry." I told Dominic I'd bring nothing but myself Saturday. I did not yet understand exactly how much that promise was about to change. To understand why that phrase landed the way it did, you have to go back 9 years, to the manuscript sale that quietly reshaped my relationship with my family's business. The piece was a supposedly authentic 1787 letter attributed to a minor founding father, offered to my father by a dealer he'd worked with for over a decade, priced to sell quickly to a private collector eager to add it to his collection before a major auction the following month. I examined it, out of the same habit I bring to everything, and found the ink composition inconsistent with period-accurate iron gall formulations, along with subtle indentation evidence suggesting the signature had been traced from a genuine exemplar rather than written freehand. I brought my findings to my father in a folder, calm and factual, the way I present everything. He read 2 pages before sliding it back across the counter. Celeste, this dealer and I have done business for 12 years. I trust my eye more than a lab test on paper this old. You're overthinking a sale that's already moving. My mother, standing nearby, added, softer but no less final, You've always been the cautious one, sweetheart. That's fine for courtrooms. This is a business built on relationships, not just science. I didn't push further, not then. The sale went through. 8 months later, the collector's own independent authentication, commissioned for insurance purposes, confirmed exactly what I'd found. The resulting quiet scandal cost my father 2 long-standing client relationships and a noticeable dent in the dealership's reputation among serious collectors. A loss he never once, in the years that followed, connected publicly to the folder I'd handed him 8 months earlier. I want to be fair to my father, in the way I've learned to be fair to clients whose instincts fail them out of pride rather than malice. He'd built that business on trust and personal relationships in an era before forensic science became standard practice in the field, and admitting my methods had caught something his decades of experience missed felt, to him, like admitting the ground beneath his entire career had shifted. I understand that now. I didn't understand it then, watching him choose a dealer's decade-long friendship over his own daughter's training. Here's the part I don't say out loud very often. Despite everything, some quiet, stubborn part of me still measured my worth against that back room where I'd learned to love paper and ink before I understood any of it scientifically. Some part of me, walking into that Saturday reading, still hoped this codicil would simply be exactly what Dominic described. A minor adjustment, nothing more. A moment where my family finally trusted the training I'd built my entire career on, instead of dismissing it one more time. My closest colleague, Priya, a fellow forensic examiner who's watched 9 years of this exact family pattern from professional distance, didn't hold back when I told her about the codicil. Celeste, your family is asking you to sit in a room and not examine a legal document, the one thing you are professionally incapable of not examining. That's not a request for calm. That's a request for you to disable the one skill that would protect you. She wasn't wrong, and I went anyway because grief and old hope wear the same clothes sometimes, and some quiet, unfinished part of me still wanted to walk into that reading and find a family that had finally, after 9 years, decided my expertise counted for something, even now, even without my father there to dismiss it himself. I arrived at my parents' house Saturday afternoon expecting a small, difficult gathering, my mother, Dominic, and the family's longtime attorney, Harold Nesbitt, going through paperwork at the same dining table where I'd grown up doing homework. What I found, walking in, was Harold, yes, but also 2 of the dealership's senior staff, a business consultant I didn't recognize, and my Aunt Rosa, all gathered with the particular tense efficiency of people who wanted this finished quickly. The small, sharp details registered before anyone said a word. My mother's reading glasses, the same worn pair she'd had for years, sat folded beside a stack of paperwork, one arm repaired with a strip of tape she'd clearly meant to replace properly and hadn't. Across the table, a fresh leather portfolio, unmistakably new, held the codicil itself, its crisp edges and expensive stitching entirely at odds with the modest, practical way my father had run every other piece of paperwork through that business for 40 years. Performed formality on one side of the table, quiet financial strain on the other, the exact contrast I'd learned to notice in a decade of walking into contested estates for a living. The small comments started almost immediately, dressed in the particular warmth my family reserves for things they don't respect. My Aunt Rosa squeezed my arm and said, "Isn't it nice you get to use your little magnifying glass hobby on something that actually matters to the family for once?" One of the dealership's senior staff, a longtime employee named Frank, added, not unkindly, "Must be strange being the one who tests things instead of the one who feels them out, like your dad did." Dominic himself, arranging papers at the head of the table, called over his shoulder, "Let's not turn this into one of your courtroom moments, Celeste. Just hear the terms." Harold Nesbitt began reading through the original will first, the document I'd seen years earlier, splitting the dealership and the estate roughly evenly between Dominic and me, consistent with everything my father had ever told me about his intentions. Then he moved to the codicil, dated 3 weeks before my father's death, and I felt the room shift as he read the revised terms, the dealership and nearly 90% of the estate's value redirected to Dominic, with a token, specific sum left to me, alongside a paragraph, in language that did not sound remotely like my father, explaining that this reflected his considered judgment regarding the appropriate stewardship of the family legacy. I stepped away from the table quietly, telling my mother I needed water, and found myself instead in the small office off the kitchen, where my father kept get-well cards from friends during his final illness, several still sitting in a stack he'd apparently never gotten around to filing. I pulled one out, a birthday card from a colleague, signed only 6 weeks before his death. His signature on it was visibly unsteady, the tremor in his hand by that point in his illness unmistakable to anyone who'd watched him decline the way I had, visiting every other weekend those final months. I carried that card back to the dining table and set it beside the codicil, the two signatures inches apart under the overhead light. Stay with me, because what I found in that comparison, standing at my parents' dining table with a room full of witnesses, changed the entire shape of that afternoon. The signature on the get well card, 6 weeks before death, showed the unmistakable tremor and reduced pressure control consistent with his diagnosed illness. The signature on the codicil, dated 3 weeks before death, further into his decline, showed none of that tremor at all. Fluid, confident, evenly pressured strokes, inconsistent with a hand that, by every medical record I'd later confirm, could barely hold a pen steady enough to sign a hospital consent form by that point. My mother found me examining both signatures under my small UV flashlight, the one I'd brought without quite admitting to myself why, and her face did the thing it does when she's already decided how a conversation is going to end before it begins. Celeste, don't make this complicated. Your father's handwriting changed a lot near the end. This isn't the time to turn Dad's will into an evidence exhibit. Second delivery, aimed directly at me now, in the house where I'd first learned every method I was currently using. Dominic crossed the room, his voice tight. Celeste, put that away. This is exactly what I meant. We have an attorney, a properly notarized document, and a family that needs to move forward. It's not that complicated. Just accept the terms and let's finish this. Third delivery, in front of Harold Nesbitt, Aunt Rosa, and 2 staff members who'd clearly been positioned in that room to make refusal feel socially expensive. I let the silence sit. 1 second, 3, 5 full seconds while Harold glanced between the 2 signatures on the table, while my mother's composure held by a visibly thinning thread. Then I said, quiet, level, Dad's handwriting 3 weeks before his death would show tremor, reduced pressure control, and shortened stroke length consistent with his diagnosed condition at that point. This signature shows none of that. I'm not accepting anything until I understand why. Harold Nesbitt, to his credit, leaned forward and studied both signatures himself. Celeste, are you suggesting this document is fraudulent? I'm suggesting it needs proper forensic examination before anyone signs anything further, I said, pulling my full kit from my bag, the same one I bring to every professional engagement. I'd like to examine the original page directly, under raking light, for indentation evidence. If someone traced this signature from a genuine exemplar, there will be faint indentation marks on the page beneath it, even if the visible signature looks clean. Dominic tried first, stepping forward too quickly. This is insane. You're turning Dad's funeral into a trial. I'm turning a legal document into what it should have been from the start, I said, properly examined. I angled my small raking light across the codicil's second page, the one beneath the signature, and there it was, faint but unmistakable under the right angle. Indentation grooves matching the exact shape and proportions of my father's authentic signature, the kind left behind when someone places a genuine signed document beneath a blank page and traces the shape through with firm, deliberate pressure. Not his hand at all. A tracing of it. Harold's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something considerably harder. Celeste, I need to know who notarized this document. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Dominic's second attempt landed worse than his first, a stammered explanation about the notary being a family friend who came by the house that trailed off entirely once Harold asked, directly, for that notary's name and license number, information Dominic clearly did not have ready. I called the notary listed on the codicil myself, right there at the table, on speaker, my hands steady in the way they always are for exactly this kind of moment. The woman who answered, a licensed notary named Denise Farrar, confirmed within 30 seconds exactly what the indentation evidence had already told me. I'm sorry. I don't have a Vincent Marchetti in my log for that date. I'd need to check my records, but that name isn't ringing a bell at all. Dominic's third attempt was the quietest, and the most telling. He simply stopped talking entirely, staring at the table, while Aunt Rosa looked between him and my mother with an expression sliding rapidly from confusion into something much colder. I don't owe this codicil my signature, I said, finally, into the silence. I never did. The codicil was formally challenged in probate court within the month, and the forensic findings I documented that afternoon, later confirmed independently by a lab neither Dominic nor I had any connection to, were more than sufficient to void it entirely. I want to be honest that I didn't feel triumphant watching that process unfold. What I felt mostly was tired and genuinely sad, learning over the following weeks exactly how the document had come to exist. Denise Farrar, it turned out, had never notarized anything for my father. Her stamp had been used without her knowledge by an associate of Dominic's business consultant, a man who'd offered quietly to help simplify the estate transition once the dealership's mounting debts, hidden from me and largely from my mother as well, made Dominic desperate for full control of assets he could sell or leverage before creditors circled further. The consultant faced serious legal exposure for his role in the fraud. Dominic, facing both civil liability and the very real possibility of criminal charges, ultimately reached a settlement that restored the estate to its original, valid terms, alongside a formal admission of what he'd done, delivered not warmly, but delivered nonetheless. I did not pursue every consequence available to me, though Priya reminded me more than once that I'd have had every right to. What I did instead was work with Harold to ensure the dealership itself, still a functioning business employing people who'd known my father for decades, survived the transition intact under proper, transparent management, rather than collapsing entirely under the weight of what Dominic had tried to hide. The quieter thing happened 3 weeks later, sorting through my father's private office alone, when I found, tucked inside an old ledger, a short handwritten note addressed to me, undated, that I authenticated later almost reflexively out of habit, confirming what I already knew in my chest before the ink chemistry ever told me. Celeste. I was wrong about the 1787 letter. I've been wrong more than I've let myself admit. You see things I trained myself not to. I don't know how to say that at dinner, so I'm writing it here instead, for whenever you find it. I'm proud of you. I should have said it out loud years ago. What I learned, standing in my parents' dining table with a raking light angled across a forged signature, is that the truth doesn't need to be complicated to be real. It only needs someone patient enough to actually look, under the right light, for exactly as long as it takes. My family spent 9 years calling my expertise unnecessary. In the end, it was the only thing in that room that couldn't be traced, argued with, or quietly explained away. That's my story. If it meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me. I read every one. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe to her final chapter because there's another one waiting for you next week.